Despite being over 100 years old, there's something about the horror of H.G. Wells's The War of the Worlds, and specifically the Martian tripods that feature in it, that I think is actually very modern. Although being more commonly associated with science fiction, which of course it is, there's also an understated creepiness about the story's metal monsters, that despite being a creation from the Victorian era, somehow fits so perfectly in our internet age. I came to this realization when playing one of the many versions of the War of the Worlds game by indie developer GelatoDev, a game that has evolved so dramatically throughout the years, it seems practically every update of it is a new game built from scratch. As I was going about my business existing in this very almost PS1 looking Victorian England that was at the very inception of the invasion by the Martian tripod machines, I heard something that I'd never heard before in any other version of this game, and actually still never have done in any version since. Hearing this very creepy sounding siren was certainly unsettling, but it also reminded me of something. It reminded me of one of the many popular horror characters that have popped up on the internet in recent years. Specifically, Siren Head, created by Trevor Henderson, a towering, slim humanoid titan that I think came to great prominence around 2020. And as his name suggests, you guessed it, Siren Head has a siren for a head, which naturally produces very creepy sounding siren noises. Being reminded of such a recent creature that had populated popular culture at that time made it really strike me just how advanced Worlsd was when originating his Martian fighting machines. You might be thinking, well, you're comparing a similarity between a modern internet creation and a modern game, but actually the reason the sirens were in the game is because it's deliberately being faithful to the novel, or at least I assume that's the reason anyway. Worlsd implicitly wrote that the tripods made such siren-like noises, writing, "These Martians did not advance in a body but in a line, each perhaps a mile and a half from his nearest fellow. They communicated with one another by means of siren-like howls, running up and down the scale from one note to another." Already this constructs in the reader's imagination such a spine-chilling scene, just picturing these tall machines in the distance making these haunting howling noises. Very unusual noises, especially when you consider they didn't really have sirens back then in the way that we do now. We always hear in police sirens and that, or at least I do in my area, which is stuff that they didn't have back then. Mechanical sirens had only been invented, I think, within that century. In fact, in an earlier part of the story, again when they make these same noises, Wells actually describes them in such a way as to suggest that the reader may be unfamiliar with what sirens are, writing, "My attention was diverted from this death flurry by a furious yelling, like that of the thing called a siren in our manufacturing towns," which I suppose suggests a deliberate desire by him to make the tripods seem very modern, by having them communicate in such a way that apparently evokes what at that time I'd guess was seen as a very modern invention, or at least new enough that he felt the need to phrase it as though under the assumption that some people might be unfamiliar with it, which in turn was likely done to reinforce the idea that these machines are meant to be at a more technologically advanced level compared to humans, a key component of the story. What I find really interesting about this is a detail about the tripods that is kind of forgotten, I would say. I can't think of a single adaptation that shows them doing this, making these very creepy howling siren-like noises. I personally don't think the iconic tripod horn from the 2005 Spielberg film counts, nor the ooh-la from the Jeff Wayne musical version, as I feel like these are portraying different noises that the fighting machines make, as opposed to being a replacement of the siren-like sounds. Oh, I just realised while editing this is also corroborated by the game, which has them doing the horn noise as something separate to the siren sounds. And yet here we are over a century later, and this stuff fits in so perfectly with the type of modern creations thriving on the internet, as though it were one of them. The description of the siren alone may be creepy, but it's even more so when you complement the text with some of the utterly horrifying illustrations of these towering tripods, especially those done by Brazilian artist Alvin Correia in the early 1900s. There's been many depictions of fighting machines over the years, yet it's no wonder H.G. Wells himself personally expressed how pleased he was with these versions in particular, as perhaps no other captures both the uncanny and creepy vibe of them. In fact, that's probably a massive factor as to why these fighting machines in particular have captured the internet's imagination in a way no other has done. The most well known are almost undoubtedly the 2005 version, of course. They're definitely the most mainstream, but the Correia ones have such a strong cult following, I wouldn't be surprised if most fan art done of the War of the Worlds is of them. Partly I think that's because firstly they're quite simple, so they're easy to depict, yet it's also inherently a design that's so naturally creepy, yet expressive, in a way that just fits with the other creepy stuff that's popularised online nowadays. Obviously not in exactly the same way, but the thread that they have in common is such stuff on the internet usually depicts realistic things, yet adds an element of the disturbingly absurd in there, such as taking what I assume was an ordinary photograph of a dog and putting a big grin and menacing eyes on it, pair it with an urban legend, and suddenly you have a horrifying viral entity spreading by casually popping up in people's emails and forum posts. Likewise, the War of the Worlds goes into quite a bit of detail about what happens to those that are captured by the Martians, building up this terrifying fate of those unfortunate enough to encounter them. It's quite gruesome, really. The Martian creatures themselves are quite horrifying. I'm not even going to go into the specifics here because it's a topic that deserves its own video. I'm just pointing out that, kind of a similar thing, Wells built up both a legend and a creepy entity and had them act in a way as to suggest that if they were real, the person reading this story would or could encounter them. Similarly, this was kind of what was so startling to the Victorian readers of the War of the Worlds at the time it came out. Wells specifically set his story in the most normal places, standard little villages, actual real-life cities and sleepy suburbs, and then had this normal environment intruded upon by this literal alien element. It's this high contrast between the standard and the strange that is perhaps even more resonant today. The fact Wells was writing this stuff well over 100 years ago is pretty darn impressive. And then you've got Correia putting weird cartoony eyes on realistic things to make them creepy, long before anyone on the internet was doing that. That's like standard now. It's kind of weird just how prophetic these drawings are in that way. The eye's perfect circularity contrasts with the chaotic realistic ruin of the Victorian environment in much the same way as we see in analog horrors and that sort of thing. A realistic image intruded upon by an unsettling aspect. I feel like the reaction to the eyes has kind of gone on a bit of a roller coaster, as from what I understand, at the time, early 1900s, they wouldn't have looked silly to the people back then, instead being quite disturbing, as though like the purely visual organs of a being that has evolved past human physical needs. But as time passed on, and probably by 100 years later, I guess the general perspective would be that these once scary details look kinda goofy. Yet with the rise of the internet, suddenly this has actually become exactly the type of thing that people are doing to things to make them supposedly disturbing. But what adding this feature to these tripods does is bring them to life. And this internet horror stuff is more commonly known as creepypasta, right? Which originally basically meant like a scary story or legend that originated and was shared on the internet, and it still does. But I would argue that the term has shifted somewhat into specifically relating to characters or entities, rather. You look up creepypasta in Google Images, and there's very clearly a focus on characters. I mean, I guess you could argue, well, what else would it show? But still, my point is, creepypasta is perhaps most well known for its monsters, and so I find it really interesting that the depiction Wells wholeheartedly endorsed were not the featureless metal structures by the original artist Warwick Goebel, whose mechanical illustrations Wells actively reviled, but was instead the drawings that made the tripods out to be living entities themselves. Which plays into this next part, as what's striking is the blatant emphasis on their height. Obviously, the tripods are always massive, but in these pictures particularly, it really feels like the angles have been deliberately decided on to specifically showcase that aspect of them to its fullest extent. And I think that's a very modern thing in combination with the eyes, just the fact that they are gigantic monsters. In fact, they are the first gigantic monsters in modern media, arguably. I mean, sure, you had Jules Verne writing about the giant squid and prehistoric reptiles a couple of decades earlier, but they're at the very least exaggerations of real creatures. Giant squids exist and so do dinosaurs. Or did. And plus, you had to go 20,000 leagues under the sea or journey to the center of the earth to encounter them. The fighting machines were placed right on your doorstep, the first gigantic monsters to come along and invade and destroy cities, at the time a truly unique concept that went on to influence so much, building the foundations that led to things such as the very popular kaiju subgenre and its giant destructive monsters like Godzilla that are likewise shown as unstoppable forces, easily dispensing with the military and attacking major cities. And while I'm on the subject of Japanese genres, it made me think, perhaps the tripods even influenced the mecha giant robots, although actually I'm probably massively stretching with that comparison. Okay, maybe not. I just checked the Wikipedia page for mecha and it literally references the tripods under the early history section. One of the first appearances of such mecha machines in modern literature was the tripod, or fighting machine as they are known in the novel of H.G. Wells's famous The War of the Worlds in 1897. Apparently not as absurd a connection as I was concerned it would be. Goes to show just how ahead of his time and pioneering Wells was when creating the tripods. The idea of placing these monsters on your street is something that has endured and even flourished on the internet. Let's go back to Siren Head for example, or specifically this video of the character, which after a while searching I've just found the origin of it as being created by Alex Howard. This is my personal favourite video of Siren Head, and it's no wonder why, it's so well done. It perfectly captures that creepy, gigantic monster in the distance slowly heading towards you feeling. For me, it's always really evoked War of the Worlds, particularly certain shots from the 2005 film. The views of the tripods from a distance are always so unsettling, especially as they're shown here, knowing that there's this unstoppable force right there that you can see yet do nothing to stop but run. I've had dreams of seeing this tripod exactly like this, but down my street. It's such an iconic image, and now it feels very ahead of its time as FX artists, or any kind of artist, portray such creatures in a similar manner on the internet. So when I eventually made the connection between the sirens, I was like, oh yeah, that's kinda weird how modern this creepy yet little known aspect of the tripods are. It's like a continuous thread. It's a story as old as time. Guy creates creepy creature, artist depicts creepy creature. That's about it actually. Just interesting how this same perennial process is still going on. We now have enough such entities on the internet to have a war of the World Wide Web. Gosh, I tried so hard to fit that pun in, that's the best I could do. This century has produced so many celebrated creepypasta creations, yet the tripods from the Victorian era still stand tall among them, fitting in perfectly and being as popular as ever in this internet environment as enduring mythic figures. But what's remarkable about it is the tripod doesn't feel like the ancestor of all this stuff. It feels like their contemporary, almost like a proto-creepypasta creation. It just goes to show how the themes of human powerlessness caused by disturbing entities presented in the internet's unique brand of terror reverberates with the shockingly modern creepy nature of the War of the Worlds.